I'm Sara Muriello, and I'm going to be presenting on property rights through a sample shelter animal adoption contract. In the US, property can essentially be divided into two property types. So we've got real property, which is land and any property attached to the land. And then there's personal property, which is all other property, including intellectual property that is not real property. And currently in the United States, pets are considered personal property under the law. There are three property rights elements that inform property law, and those concepts or elements are universality, exclusivity, and transferability. So, universality deals with the concept that every limited resource is going to have somebody who owns it because it is a limited resource and therefore valuable. Exclusivity asserts that a property owner has the right to exclude others from the property, thus making themselves the owner of that property. And transferability is the concept that an owner has the right to convey his or her property rights to another person because they, in fact, are the exclusive owners of that property. So the question is, where does a shelter animal adoption contract fit into all of this? Well, since pets are considered private property under the law in the US, the purpose of an adoption contract is to provide legal protection for all parties involved in the adoption, whether that's the adopter, the adoptee, like a shelter or a rescue, and the pet being adopted. There are numerous laws on the books in California that deal with animal welfare and more specifically with how, when, in what manner, and to whom a pet can be adopted from a shelter or a rescue. So now that we understand that the purpose of an animal adoption contract is to protect all parties involved in that adoption, we can also understand the elements required. And the elements of this particular contract include adoption of animal, which is a description of the animal being adopted, ownership transfer from the shelter to the adopter, animal adopted as is, that the shelter is not responsible for the animal's behavior or physical condition, that any expenses related to the animal are now the responsibility of the new owner. The owner has a responsibility of care, which are the expectations of the shelter for how that owner will care for that animal. Media release in case the shelter would like to use the adopter's photo for social media purposes or other marketing purposes. A release and waiver of liability, which is probably the most crucial part of the contract because it deals with bites in particular, rescission of adoption, and that the shelter has the right to rescind the adoption and take back the animal if the shelter has evidence that the animal is being mistreated in the new home. There are also general provisions, which I'll talk about more in the next slide, and then enough final release of liability and indemnification. So I wanted to highlight three contract provisions in particular. The first one being ownership transfer, which deals with the property rights element of transferability. So in this particular clause of the contract, it essentially describes that the owner of an animal, in this case the shelter, has the right to convey their property rights, in this case to the pet, to another party. So when a shelter animal is adopted, it goes from the custody of the shelter to the custody of the new owner. The second contract provision I wanted to highlight was the rescission of adoption, which essentially acts as a breach of contract clause because it allows the shelter to rescind the adoption and take back the animal should the adopter violate terms of the contract. Most shelters are concerned with intentional abuse, neglect, or cruelty, um, and very rarely invoke such a provision of a contract. But they do put it in there in the interests of the animal's welfare. The third contract provision I wanted to highlight was the general provisions. And this provision refers to the peril evidence rule, which says that a written agreement is the full and final expression of the parties' intentions and can't be altered or contradicted by any oral or written agreements made prior to the written agreement. And I think the reason this particular provision is really important for an adoption contract is that often prior to an adoption, there are adoption counselors and volunteers who are trying really hard to get that animal adopted. And in doing so, may make statements that could be perceived as a potential guarantee or promise by that adopter about the animal that they're interested in. And so I would say that it's really important for a shelter to have a general provision like this in an adoption contract to protect themselves and to ensure that all parties involved in the adoption are really clear on the terms of the contract. Finally, I do just want to point out that there are multiple organizations in the United States that are pushing for pets and other animals to not be considered personal property. One of those organizations is the Animal Legal Defense Fund. Um, and so, if animals are not to be considered personal property under the law in the future, that will change the animal welfare landscape significantly, and it will certainly impact shelter-related, policies, as well as pet adoption contracts. So I'm very interested to see what the future holds for animal welfare law in the U.S.